line with our Labor Act at face value? Obviously, we may not necessarily always appreciate good somebody and a coupe, but at face value, does it feel as if this action is legal?
Thank you for probably where we'd want to start from is the fact that a contract in itself is sacrosanct. It's a sui generis contract which is unique on its own. And when you have a meeting of minds to say that I, as an employee, am going to give you my services, it entails that I have rights and the employer has obligations to meet. So in instances whereby you have a unilateral variation of that contract, that is to say it's one-sided, I have not been engaged, I have not probably if I'm part of a trade union, if I'm part of probably a works council, no consultations have been done, and all of a sudden I wake up, there's a notice to say that my salary has been reduced. Surely that is illegal.
Yeah, got you. Vasibanda ndofunga mama katera Miss Mura vachitaura vachirondedzera ivo kuti for it to feel like it's unilateral pasina hurukuro inogorashika izvozvo hazvingava zviri pamutemo. In your opinion, does the law outline how salary or how pay cuts must be instituted? Tawamuchitaura imimi kuti tofanira kuziva kuti zvimwe pane zvikonzero zvinoitika zvisiri mhosva yebhizimusi, fine, but is the law coming in to outline how a salary pay cut must be instituted?
Right. The letter that you read, or the notice that you say it was on the notice board.
Right.
That notice is specific to the regard what is going to be reduced, which is COLA. I agree with my sister that the contract cannot be unilaterally altered or salaries cannot be unilaterally reduced if they are cancelled into the contract. However, COLA is a very unique thing which actually has developed with our labor relations. What am I saying? We need to look at that particular organization and how that COLA was delivered to the employees. It could have been delivered by an employer who looked at the workers' circumstances and said, workers, I realize that your salaries have been eroded. Your salaries have actually been eroded. Sorry, I'm getting interruptions. Your salaries have actually been eroded. And then he just gave the workers COLA and said, this is to cushion you in the meantime. If there is the word in the meantime, and the employer put a clear statement to say this COLA can be withdrawn at any time, it's within the employer's rights to give workers a notice to withdraw the COLA. That is given to the workers by employer, where he says, workers, this COLA is into your salaries, and this COLA can be, will be included in your salaries in the next salary adjustments until the salaries catch up with your basic salary and COLA combined, and an agreement is signed. On that kind of COLA, the employer cannot unilaterally remove it because it's COLA that is actually going to be absorbed into salaries as time goes on. So basically what we need to look at is the documentation, and the agreement that was made when the COLA was given. It is one that will guide us whether the employer has the right to withdraw it or he doesn't have a right.
Yeah, COLA papa. Mura, if you could come in, COLA stands for cost of living adjustment. And why specifically target COLA when we're talking about pay reductions?
But if they keep it as COLA, COLA sits outside the territory of pensions, the territory of other statutory obligations the employer has except tax. So the employer wants something that he can withdraw when he can no longer afford it. So most employer would say, this is discretional COLA that we are giving you. knowing very well that when the employer cannot afford it, is the variable he can actually temper out.
Good morning, it's Workers on Wednesday, 9:28. Tirikuzeya nyaya dzekukatigwa mari dzati dzichibhadha kwadzodzi. Pamwe pacho unowana yangova tsamba, and you can imagine receiving a letter like the one put on a notice board which reads something like what I'm going to read to you in a moment. How have you navigated salary cuts? Kwenye kubasa payakabuya 0719-100-404. Was it in consultation magamawirana here kana kuti makangozona zvaitika? Is pay reduction, do you think, as you're listening in, a strategy that is fair and justified for wherever it is that you're working? 0719-100-404. Ndiwe zvako nenguva yauya kubasa pamwe mibiko yenyu munoona tsamba pawatsu here wobva vaona ichibva kuna MD chaiyo chaiyo wobva vanyora patsamba inoti, dear valued employee, as we navigate the current business landscape, we are taking some proactive steps to ensure our organization's long-term viability and success. For us to achieve this, we are going to be introducing salary adjustments effective of November. These changes will impact your cost of living allowances, COLA, and will vary from 7% to 27% based on your individual performance over the last year. Your head of department will communicate your specific adjustments. These measures will remain in place until our financial position improves. We recognize that this may be a cause of concern, and we want to assure you that this decision was carefully considered. Our objective is to create a fair, performance-driven environment where exceptional contributions are recognized and rewarded. If you have any questions or concerns, do reach out to your head of department. HR's door is also open. Thank you for your understanding and your ongoing commitment. Yours sincerely, the MD. Wawana tsamba yakadai kwenye kubasa. If this has happened, how did you respond to this? And do you think salary adjustments themselves are indeed a fair way to navigate difficulties any organization may be facing? 0719-100-404. When you are looking at your salary being cut, is this a fair and justified strategy for your business? 0719-100-404. He's a lawyer. We also have in the studio Muriel Hondoga. She's also a lawyer, helping us understand exactly how legal it is for you to experience a pay cut, particularly when it may feel as if there has been no prior discussions, at least from the letter that you see on the notice board, that this sort of action was coming. Muriel, just looking at this letter, it seems as if there were no discussions. Otherwise, we might expect there to be mention of the Works Council, mention of meetings that happened that have led to a decision where we are agreeing as an organization that indeed we're going to be expecting salary adjustments. Or is this an assumption that's not necessary, particularly because
you would find that the Labor Act in its totality, if you look at it, it's quite an act where consultations and engagements are very key and very important. And this particular situation is no exception at all. There has to be need for consultation. In fact, if you look at Section 12D of the Labor Act, I would presume that what the employer would want to do is specifically to try to look for measures to try and avoid retrenchment. And in doing so, there are certain steps that need to be taken. And this letter on its own is actually a step out of the procedures that need to be taken by the employer.
Alright, so sakatoboti vashandi vafunga kuti ngatimbotarisa imari dziri kuhora vanhu. What steps should they actually institute, especially in a way that is acceptable at law?
So looking at Section 12D, it will tell you that there is need for notification to be given to the employees regarding issues such as salary reduction and any other pertinent issues that can see the variation of a contract. Remember, we say that a contract is sacrosanct, and once it is signed by the parties, whatever that entails, the contents or the provisions of that contract need to be followed to the T by either party. So in instances now when we have salary reduction, it ought to be agreed between the parties and perhaps an amendment that is signed that will be part and parcel of the contract. Now, when you don't have that agreement between the employer and the employee, and the employer feels strongly that they really need to cut costs, and probably it'll get into COLA, it'll get into probably salary reduction in other aspects as well. The employer has to notify where there is an employment council, inform the employment council, and when that sector does not have an employment council, notify the retrenchment board to say that this is what we want to do. And perhaps also notify that we have tried to engage with the employees and we did not find each other. Remember, a contract is also based on the meeting of the minds to say this is what we actually want to achieve. So they ought to then notify the employment council, and where there is no employment council, they inform the retrenchment board. Now, when the retrenchment board or the employment council then takes a decision to say that probably it's not in the best interests of the employees, further steps are to be taken. They cannot just unilaterally wake up and start varying, salaries and having all sorts of things being done without consultation, without notice being given to the relevant parties.
Yeah, the interesting word that you use, the consultation and notice. Zvichireva here kuti isusu vashandi tinogona here kuramba? Vashandi vanogona here kusawirirana nekuti aiwa, we are not happy with the salary cut? Or is the notification not debatable as such? It's purely procedural, perhaps, to just say this is what we intend to do?
Whilst notice is procedural, remember, a contract, there is an offer. And if I'm to refuse your offer, I can give you a counter offer. So it's a negotiation. You are coming to me telling me that you'd want to reduce my salary. This affects my well-being. This also affects my family. Obviously, I would have reservations, and probably you would have to convince me otherwise as to why you would have to take such drastic measures. And whenever you then bring it to my attention to say that you want to engage in such an act, I have the right to also give you a counter argument to say that this is not right for me. So it's not something that can just be given and dictated to us to say that we're going to reduce salaries and that's it.
Yeah. Vasibanda, are there any legal implications of implementing pay reductions without employee consent?
You cannot reduce a salary without an employee's consent. But with COLA, it's a unique aspect. Like I say, you want to go into how the COLA was given. And the parties are actually bound by the agreement they entered into at the time the COLA is delivered. I work in that space. I think in the last 5 weeks, I have actually dealt with the COLA reductions, quite a number of them. Most of them, the employer actually clearly says that this COLA is discretionary in terms of performance of the business.
Right.
The board may withdraw it when the company can no longer afford it. And the workers' committee signed for it. And in those circumstances, we are bound by law to say the parties have no choice but to live by what they actually signed for, even if it looks oppressive. I think we take guidance from a case, I think it's Kundaima Kodora versus Care International, where the Supreme Court has said it's not the business of the court to rewrite contracts that parties have signed with their eyes open, even if the contract is found to be oppressive. What is happening to COLA, why many workers are not complaining? In good times, the employers have been actually paying 100% USD. When the CBA says either 50% USD, 50% Z. And the workers are aware of that. Their minimum wage has got default setting. The default setting are that they can pay 50% Z and 50% USD. So if the employer takes out, let's say 15, 20, 25% of the US dollar, they know that they are still better than the default settings of 50% US, 50% Z. And this is the reason why you hardly hear employees complaining with these reductions. I can confirm now that a large number of companies have actually done exactly the same in order to respond to the volatility of the Z. So why most employees have not complained about COLA reduction is because they realize that they are still better off getting the US dollar than getting the 50% ZIG or 50% USD. This is, now I'm giving you what is in the landscape. You might find, assuming the organization you are mentioning is real, the workers there would say nothing because they know the reality is that they are still much better than actually getting 50% of the volatile ZIG.
Yeah, all right, got you. So you are saying it's a common type of salary adjustment, right? How is this variation worked out between, for some people it's 5% to 25%? You know, calculate you are save as what?
No, because the moment you say it's based on a performance agreement,
right?
You need to have a solid performance management program. You need to have a clear and equitable measure of actually separating those with higher scores and those with lower scores and so forth. It becomes complex when you link any salary to performance management, because performance management tools, but how honest, because they are not 100% fair, they are subjective. Sometimes anogona kutadza kumita matargets nenyaya yekuti ana kupiwa matools ekushandisa, ana kupiwa equipment, ana kupiwa materials acho. So the notice that you read actually ventures into troubling waters in that performance management on its own and you can't implement it in an environment like years. I don't know how they were going to implement it.
Yes, got you. Muriel, as you're also looking at this notice from a legal point of view, closely working with HR, right? Looking specifically at fairness and transparency, looking at performance-based adjustments. How do you think we can actually make sure that there is indeed fairness and this transparency? Because no needs, there are biases, there could be favoritism that's there. You might be senior management. There are many biases that may come in. Discrimination can be a part of bias. Favoritism, how do we make sure as an organization that this fairness and transparency is achieved towards this performance-based salary?
I would actually agree with my learned colleague that this is actually venturing into dirty, murky water, if you might want to call it. Because whilst we do understand probably where the employer is coming from, like he has rightly pointed out, how then do you give the standard to say I'm going to reduce for Muriel, say 5%, and for Lake we're going to do 25%. And all those issues that we're talking about, favoritism, discrimination, all come into play. It becomes quite difficult to ensure that there is probably a set standard, unless probably the employer would have then said everyone, there's going to be a slash of, say, 5% for everyone.
0719-100-404. Karamakambo Sangana salary cut, it could be COLA or any kind of salary cut. We want to talk to you. How was it instituted in your workplace? Were you part of the discussion? And if you are also experiencing performance-based remuneration, how do you know that what you're receiving is a true reflection of what you've done? Is it fair and is it transparent? Let us know on 0719-100-404. 0086. Good morning. What of a company that does not communicate whatsoever about the adjustments and you only get to know of it at the bank? It is very unfair and unjust. A lot in the private sector operate in this nature. Given that there are a lot of fluctuations in the currency, how does one navigate a situation where an employer pays the same ZIG amount for say 2, ignoring the fluctuations? How does an employee navigate this? Muriel, how should an employee navigate this? I know you're a lawyer, less likely HR, but how should an employee navigate this?
I think like my learned colleague Mr. Sibanda rightfully said, to say that we would want to look at the agreement at inception. We would want to see what it speaks to regarding this reduction and probably the ZIG component and how it works throughout the contract. Where you would find that there is a need for consultations to be done and they're not done, that becomes unlawful. Where there is probably, there's always that fine print in contracts to say that it can be done at the discretion of the employer. And sometimes the employer, unfortunately, they do not read that fine print. So you'd find that you'd get into situations like this, and unfortunately for the listener, it could be a situation whereby if the contract is that fine print that they don't see, then we will need probably to try and negotiate. But if it's not there, then clearly that's
so but discretion iri kureva here kuti hatiudziwi zvachose tongosangana nazvo mubengi here. What harm would they be in just notifying your employees that indeed, because of the fluctuations that may happen, expect some sort of adjustment? Zvinoita here kuti vanhu vongozomuka vaona yakashota?
Like I alluded to earlier, the Labour Act in itself has a lot of engagement and consultations that needs to be done. Ordinarily, consultation, or rather just a notification to say that, look, in terms of your contracts, there's this particular clause that gives us the discretion of, reducing salaries to cut costs, or whenever we have got an economic meltdown, just to try and have things done. The notification should come, and people should be reminded to say, look, you signed a contract. Go back to your contract. This says that. And a person has, at the back of their mind, the fact that, oh, okay, there are these clauses that are embedded in my contract, and I should anticipate this.
Yeah. It is Capital 100.4 FM, Harare Zabi. Do you think it's a fair strategy to reduce salaries as a cost-cutting measure? Is it fair and justified? Kubasa kwenyu kuona mari yagugwa zvichi aiwa nokuti hatisi kuona mari yakakwana chimbotambira 15 instead of 45, particularly looking at my allowances aya makola aya anenge agara akanyogwa kunzi they are subject to change based on different valuables. Noboti haisi mari yako yemazuva ese iyo iri kola iyoyo. Ko vanhu vazhinji vasiri kuwana kola iyoyi vari kutoziva kuti mari dzavo dzakabatwa directly vari kuzvifambisa sei. Zvikaifo lake ina handina kana kutombowana notice, takangozowana zvanzengo. 1361 zvikanzi tracking industry pakaipa mari dzaunoudzwa kuti ndo dzaunofanwa kuwana haudziwane because companies they peg fuel consumption ratio yavanoziva kuti mota dzavo hadzifi dzakaibata nekuda kwekuti dzakura vanodzitakudza tonnage yakawandisa. So ndo pavanobva vabatira madrivers vachiti diesel short, pari kuitwa hiring and firing of drivers. It is serious. Every week drivers recruitment. Why? Alright, my feelings ava vari kufila iwawawa. Zvikaisaka mutemo unozokundwa nekuona kuoma kweupenyu munyika here? This is a very interesting question. And to that we were trying to get a hold of Justice Chinema is a trade unionist. We wanted to hear how trade unions come in to support employees from potential pay cuts that may happen. Do they have a role in advocating for employees, and how do they mediate? Because pamwe pacho panogona kusasawirirana dzekuti vanhu havasi kuda kuti mari dzavo dzibahwe. Who then adjudicates? Itai, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Itai is our labor consultant also on the line. Itai, paita mvunzo pano, looking at the law, how then is it protecting actively Vashandi from these pay cuts, whether it's COLA, whether it's your salary, whatever it is? How would you say the law in itself is coming in on a practical level to protect workers from notices quite like this one on the notice board?
Well, and good morning. I was actually listening in. It's quite interesting. What I wanted to say first, Polati, is the fact that we need to have a close appreciation of what COLA is really meant to do. Remember that this cost of living adjustment. Zvekuti mueconomy matiri mune inflation, maprices ezvinhu ari kukwira. Regai ndikupe muenzaniso uri practical. Kana kuri kumedical care, handiti chiti mutengo yezvekuti urapiwe yakwira. Mitengo yetransport ikombi yaunokwira kana fuel yakwira. Mitengo yerent yakwira. Saka is within our Labor Act now. But we will always try to cushion or to maintain the real value of the salary. We think that in the purchasing power at no day. No panels go where this concept here quality, no cheap on the salary and benefits of the employees. Like advocates and rightly say, there are two ways is either negotiated or is discretionary. Employer ndiye anogona kungotsveta madiro ake
right
iyo kana akanga adero anokwanisa kuibvisa nguva yake yaanoda but zvinongozonoaffecta again maissues aya tinogara tichitaura employee engagement kana zvikasaitiwa in a fair manner. Then coming specifically to your question, Polak, you will see, like also the council rightly said there, our labor act ukaitarisa in terms of philosophy, the general thinking yayo iri pluralistic in nature, inobatanisa kureva kuti haisi kungoti employer ega ndiye ane answer, inoti employer gara pasi nemushandi wako employee, whoever is responsible by stakeholders munogara pasi for that. Saka in this case we have got my institutions atinopiwa nelabor act iyoyi anoprotecta vashandi ndekuti kana tikange tashandisa route yatati negotiated iyi zvichareva kuti employer paachada kunoredusa achasika a table, achasika a dialogue with the works council who come in or the trade union who come in on the part of the employees. Saka ndo inenge iri sort of protection, but zvese zvandataura polake uchaona kuti pachasara pane ma-question mark ekuti indataura kuti kola iri kuiswa because we are trying to maintain the real value, the real purchasing power yemari yemushandi. But isusu manje kana tikati taakuzviredusa imo mueconomy muchiratidza kuti zvinhu zviya zviri kukwira, vashandi mari yavo iri kuramba ichiluza power. Inini chandenda kuona chandogona kutaura ndechekuti is an employer who is bent on introducing performance-based wages or productivity-linked wages indirectly.
Right. Ipapo nyaya iyoyi ye-performance-based wages iyoyi tichiri kutsvaka kuisa kuti HR yacho painozounza nyaya idzodzidzi dze-performance-based vanomeka sure sei kuti pane a sense of transparency, a sense of fairness, nekuti tiri vanhu ka hatisi AI, panogona kutaka tinoziva sei kuti hapaiti mabias panyaya idzodzidzi dze-performance based remuneration vabhodha. And also ndiri kutarisa kuti kana tamboti kola iyi iri kubetseredza mari inogona ine dambudziko, that means it's important even if it's at the discretion of the employer, right? It is somewhat bringing the value you were speaking of that may be tempered with economic environment. Ndizvo saka kana yatobviswa, I think it's still glaring that it is an important part of whatever it is that we are making nekuti iri kubetseredza. Kana maibvisa hamusi here mari dzamamshetara dzamakombi nei still nyangwe yanga ichita setingopuhwa hedu nemuridzi webhizimusi, hazvisi zvere zviri kungokanganisa magariro nemashandiro anga achaita vashandi vabhodha. So a couple of questions there. HR ichaita sei kuti iyo performance based iyoyi inyatsoita namazvo chaizvo zvisina kubiridzira, but also the idea of potential demotivation kana mabvisa yekola yacho yangaita kuti zvinyatsonakiridza
ndiyo reality chaiyo polake yawatoita iyoyo, nekuti tarikaona kuti tinge tichiti zviri fair, we must have an objective system that will be put in place. Saka izvi zvine zvakuchida ma-HR experts manje ndo vanochiuya nema-HR matrix aya tochiti kuti titimisi bhonda vapefoma zvinodarika polake vanenge vaita ABC, but uchaona kuti tinenge tiine maproblems akawanda because remember we also have got what we call team performance. Saka apa tinenge takuita taakukurudzira individualistic pabasa. Zvinozobatsira here indiziva ndikaisa effort yangu yakadai ndinonowana chakati, but inoziva kuti ndiachize izvozvo inini polake should have done something. Conflict acho hazvinenge zvichiunza koitawo maissue esubjectivity iwayo, ma-issues e-institutional bias polake they are difficult to deal with. Zvinotongowanika izvozvo. Remember takabhotaura kuti ma-issues e-office romenza aya ko kana ndina meri wangu ari papo zvakanaka ichiitika polat there are a lot of ma-intricacies anoitika through this performance-based work.
It's 9:53. If you remember last week, in fact, it's time for us to get into fact efficient. If you remember last week, we looked at the unseen scars, as Babunda was talking about, of sexual harassment, its impact on mental health. As always, we get to throw at you a labor statement. You get to tell us, is it fact or fiction? So, is it fact or fiction that harassment is when someone handles the situation or uses something unfairly, usually to get something that they want? Is it like pushing the boundaries in the wrong direction, trying to get benefit out of that? Whereas abuse is a straight up hostile, sometimes even hurtful behavior that's aimed at someone. Either it's in their face or it's behind their back. Is that fact or fiction? Is it fact or fiction that harassment is when someone is handling a situation or they are using something unfairly to get what they want? Whereas abuse is a straight up hurtful behavior aimed at someone in particular, either it's in their face or behind the back. Is that fact or fiction? Let us know. 0719 100 404. You know, kuti tichipeta nyaya yedu tawisa kuti kola allowance inenge yakatoisigwa ichitarisa kuti pane zvinhu zvinogona kuitika mukurarama zvinobetsera kuti mari yako isaita sekupera. Nonetheless, let me start with Babonda. Hakuna here dzimwe njira dzekuti varidzi vebhizimusi management can consider outside pay cuts that can actually help make sure that employees remain happy and motivated? Havagoni here kana kudzasa ma-hours atinenge tichitoya kubasa, for example.
Zvinoitika zvakanaka izvozvo Polati. Ndopatataura ishu yeimbotenzi yetable yenegotiation. Labour Act yedu under section 12D inopa ma-special measures anogona kuadoptiwa nekambani kuti tiavoide kuinda kumapay cuts kuti tiavoide kuinde kuredundancy chaiyo kuretrenchment kwatisingadi kuya. Saka yes, if we can use that, tichaona kuti tinogona kuti instead yekuti muye ma-hours aya anenge akatarwa aya mune makuyawo mashorter hours muchingodero hauzowana hako mari yako in full but unenge muchidi mese munenge muri accommodated muchiuya kusvika business side zvakanaka polati.
Got you. So shorter hours. Anything else that you would suggest as a thought around, you know, reducing costs rather than cutting salaries, Ponda? Okay, we seem to have lost Babunda there. Muriel, as you're looking at this situation, vasibanda vatanga vachitaya tichitarisa mudzi wenyaya tofanira kuona kuti pane zvinhu zvinoitika between the ZiG and the US dollar. From where you are standing, do you think, not even do you think, what role do you think, say, our government and our policies can actually come in to protect our employees during these times, so that manotice anozoya panotice board ekuti mari dzedu dzichakatiwa dzichadai haazonyanyi kungouya pose pose. Pane umwe atotumirawo message akati isusu kwedu kusecurity industry ndoimwewo kungokata masalary without any notices. Kwangu havape kana notice, they just cut. And you can imagine muterera ari kutisa masta nemakambani nemasekta awo havari isati kuita izvozvo. But the point is, there are many employees that are aggrieved across different industries. So any suggestions you can make around policies that our government can actually put in to protect employees from this?
All right, so I think we've been saying this throughout the show to say that the Labor Act in itself, perhaps the labor sector, is quite an engaging sector. There are a whole lot of consultations that need to be done. And I think of importance is what Mr. Bonda mentioned, to say that these consultations, to speak to the employees themselves, to try and see how they can find each other. And perhaps even when we're talking about policies, obviously consultations are done to say that, okay, whilst we understand what is going on in the country, what do you as a worker think would be a fair position? Because remember, an employer is there to make money, to make profit. And you're also there to try and, give your services whilst you're also making a living out of it. Yeah. So there has to be something that brings you to the table, and you try and find a balance to try and see how best we can try and serve both the employer and employee's interests. And particularly in this case, the employee, because look, they are almost always on the receiving end of these salary reductions and so forth. So I think that there's need for serious engagement between the parties to
Yeah.
try and see how we can balance the interests.
Yeah.
And I'm sure one way or the other, we might find a balance.
And leaving it at that note, Vasibanda, it's been a pleasure having you. Only in the interest of time, we're going to have to leave the conversation here. But I think the biggest takeaway in this discussion is the idea of collaboration between employees and the employer. Hurukuro yakakosha, and I think Muriel, sounding like a broken record, has been at pains to articulate that the Labor Act in itself has consolidated the idea that there must be continuous engagement. She also used the word consultation. She also used the word notification. Panofana kuta hurukuro kubva kuvashandi nevashandigwi kuti vasvike pekuti ivo vanonwanana. It is Capital 100.4 FM Harare Zapid. Vasibanda, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Bulawayo. We appreciate you. Thank you so much, Itai, for also joining our conversation, and to Muriel as well. Thank you so much for being on our show as we were exploring the legality around pay cuts and possible alternatives to what you as an organization can do to make sure that you keep your employees motivated, incentivized, but also create an atmosphere of transparency. Even if you are to consider a performance-based payment situation, how are you thinking of introducing mechanisms that will keep your people feeling as if it is a true reflection of what's happening on the ground? Coming up next is the news at 10, and straight after that we're going to be getting into Can you imagine, as you and I are talking, that did you know that even moderate drinking can actually increase your risk of breast cancer by up to 50%? Tune into Can in a second as we break down some of the factors that are behind alcohol and how it's actually increasing your probability of developing breast cancer. And later in Sister's Keeper, did you know that urinary tract infections are actually affecting 1 in every 2 women? We want to talk about that, and if you can, do share with us your UTI story.